So I kindly ask everyone to move closer to the panel. This is less of an informal panel; it's a discussion, and we will have also some group interaction. So I really welcome everyone to come to the first tables so that we can have a more fruitful discussion. Thank you. That seemed to work better. How is this session organized? We have just a very light introduction to make sure that everyone understands what is the topic of the discussion. We know there's a variety of participants, and the objective is that to make sure that we speak a similar language. Then we have three distinguished speakers from our experts that will delve into the topic. And we will have first a presentation from Frank. He's the director of IUCN in DC, and he's also a member of the steering committee of CPIC, which is the Coalition of Private Investment and Conservation. The second speaker we'll be hearing from is Mauricio Marins Mac. He's working in the Brazilian Ministry of Planning, Development, and Management. And he will describe some opportunity on investments in conservation in Brazil. And the last speaker would be Laura Ortiz from SVX. He is the co-founder of SVX and a partner of BIOFIN Mexico in preparing proposals for regenerative finance in the country. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce the topic. After this, thank you. After this discussion with the panelists, we'll actually split into groups, and we will try to have a more in-depth discussion with the objective to see what actions could be implemented at the country level to advance the agenda on impact investment in conservation. This is an innovative field of work, but it has started already to show results and to show leadership. What is impact investment then? And the definition is pretty simple. It's an investment that has a financial return. So this is not grant, it's not grant money, it's not pure ODA financing. It's a commercial investment. It means that where the money is put into must create a return. However, this return might not need to be at the market rate. Could be below the market rate, or just a preservation of capital, or at the market rate. The definition, what really defines impact investment, is the intentionality, meaning that the financial return is not the only consideration. There is an intention to have a positive impact, and in this case, is a positive impact on conservation or regeneration. And the third one, which is as much as important as the other 2 points, is a commitment to measure this impact. So it doesn't remain a generic willingness or aspiration, but it is a concrete commitment. There is nothing beyond that. So the universe of what impact investment is quite large. It includes different kind of asset classes. Could be bonds, could be private equity, could be loans and loan facilities. This is one of the most used examples to point on impact investors, and this is Root Capital. What is an impact investor? So it's a fund that invests money in sustainable agriculture. and measures the return in different ways, on the people reach, on the farmer that they reach, on the acres of land that are under sustainable practice of agriculture. And you see here is a relatively medium portfolio of loan disbursement over several years of over $1 billion, and with different formats and with different facilities. And what will be the impact here? What is the kind of standard company that you can think of that could both have a return on investment as well as a positive impact on conservation? And this is an example from Ghana. This is organic shea butter, and this also speaks what of our panels this morning mentioned about community organization, about different alliances of people, organizations, in order to produce economic empowerment as well as preserve the environment. This is to show that impact investment is part of the broader universe of responsible investment, and different kind of ways that investors and companies have embraced in making their operation more sustainable. And of course, you start with the traditional investors. Those are the pension funds that most likely manage your retirement your retirement income. Those are mutual funds, insurance funds that do care for the most on having a sustainable return on investment only. But the emergence of new actors, new entrepreneurs, new companies, or even part of old and well-established banks have looked into other ways to make investment more responsible. And these include ESG, the adoption of governance systems, of standards, of environment compliance mechanisms that respect the environment in a much thorough and more consistent way. And there are other actors, investment actors, that have just decided to not to invest in certain sectors, for example, the brown economy, coal plants, or other forms of investment that are particularly harmful to the environment. So those are kind of more of a defensive phase where the investor either aim to do not harm or to adopt the best practices in their business, kind of come into comparison with what impact investors aim to do, which is achieve a positive outcome. And that's what makes really the difference. And you have very different actors there, from international organizations, banks, IFC have started, and development banks have started impact investment businesses very many years ago. And you have more of the, towards the philanthropy sphere, with really actors that take huge risk in terms to create new markets and create new products that are fully sustainable. So just to understand that there are very different types of investors, type of markets, and the impact investor side is towards the higher end of the intent for impact. And there are different studies. Unfortunately, Fred for Clar Mondial could not make it here. He was one of the few that was not possible to come in here, and would have give you more of a market review of impact investment in conservation. And this slide is still generic, but it gives you a sense of the actors that are playing. And still quite a majority are market-driven actors. So here you see this is a survey from GIN, which is the sort of association of impact investors. And still there are a quite important volume, however, that is playing at below the market rate, or even just capital preservation. So you have very different kind of possibilities here. This comes from the Ecosystem Marketplace report that is done almost every year, and you see that a lot of the business activities, impact investment activity in conservation, are related in a way or another with food and sustainable agriculture or forestry. This is one of the areas where most of the activities are now taking place, both with commitment to conservation as well as to regeneration, as we'll hear afterwards. Compared to other impact investment sector, the one on conservation are towards the lower average side, meaning that the average side of a transaction is comparatively small, which actually allow different community and type of organizations, including cooperatives, to be active in the market. And here you see expectation on return on investment that has been repeated several times during the morning and will be repeated again. Is the importance of considering that impact investment can happen only if there is an expectation of return. There are a lot of other activities that need to be funded with public resources. So it's important to have this distinction in mind. And you have different players, as said before, that operate with what we say below the market average. So for example, from 0 to 4% internal rate of return, or you have more of other commercial organizations, for-profit organizations that operate on more close to market rate. This gives you a sense of the market. Finally, where the commitment are going to happen, and from surveys with investors, what are the areas that are likely to attract attention? One is certainly sustainable food and fiber. As we say, this is more the commercially oriented part of the business. But we do have other activities considering also habitat conservation, and that have a mix of sources of revenues, including for example, payment for ecosystem services, carbon sequestration, and other forms of income that are not only related to the selling of products and services. There is also an interesting market that relates to water and water management and watershed management, and we'll hear about some investment templates in this regard. As we see, the amounts of resources that are going to impact investment in conservation is still comparatively small, but it's growing fast. What we see is of course a realization of what is the demand and the supply of capital, and where are the main areas, and where this ideal meeting point between demand and supply can happen, because something that has often misled expectation is that there are different needs of enterprises and different needs from the investors. And it's very important to make sure that those match. There should be no surprises in running this list, and we'll hear more from the speakers of what are the demand, what demand for private capital is coming is from sustainable enterprises and cooperatives, sustainable forestry, fishery, and etc. And the type and resources and income that could be considered for this kind of project is quite varied. The first and uppermost is, of course, the selling of products and services, but there are other type of income that can be obtained through contracts with public or semi-public organizations, up to certain subsidies or environmental markets, such as payment for ecosystem service and carbon sequestration. I will not go too far into that, and will rather give the floor to our distinguished speakers. I will first ask Frank to give a bit of an update of the all interesting work that is happening in CIPIC and with IUCN based on your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. My name is Frank Hawkins. I'm the director of the IUCN North America office. And in that role, I've been working a lot with public and private finance institutions in North America to to see how it is that we can start to fill the financing gap in biodiversity conservation, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is extremely large and very, very hard to plug using conventional public funding. So there's a very important distinction to be drawn here between public funding and funding that comes from foundations, which is basically a straight investment without expecting any return into biodiversity, and finance, which is expecting some kind of return. And what we're going to concentrate on here today is the finance aspect of it. How is it you could structure conservation projects in order to generate a return, in order that you can repay your investors? We have to be able to do this in order to be able to cover the needs of biodiversity conservation in the future. As we've seen from Max's presentation, the impact investing world is a very promising area of growth for potentially getting significant amounts of money, not huge, but significant still, into conservation. There are a couple of major problems with making that process work. The first one is that most impact investment, in fact, almost all of it, effectively, is going into social impact, because you can measure a return on social impact much better than you can on biodiversity. You can tell how many children you've prevented from going into truancy. You can tell how many mothers are reducing the number of children they're having. You can tell any number of health-related issues that you can put money into. Social housing is a really huge growing sector in the US, because you can tell how many people have got houses. It's very hard to show an investor a return on investment in biodiversity that they're happy with, that has some kind of international value and is auditable. I'll come back to that in just a minute, but that's one problem. A second problem is it's very hard for an impact investor to actually find anything to invest in. The number of projects that are out there that are genuinely investable deals, even if they're not going to generate cash conservation terms, so 0% interest, even those aren't very common, and they're often oversubscribed. So there's a very large amount of money looking for a home in conservation projects, and that's basically the rationale for why it is that the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation was created. It was launched at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016. We have about 60 or 70 members now. The intent with the coalition is that it's very firmly anchored in the finance community, not as a conservation effort. It recognizes that in order for there to be conservation, you need conservation partners, but the main client base, if you like, is the finance world. We have to be able to show products that generate some kind of return in order that they'll get out of bed in the morning. Otherwise, they're just not interested. So what we are trying to do with the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation is to massively increase the number of investable deals in conservation that there are out there. And there's a three-step process to doing this. First of all, you need to standardize what kind of project you have on the market so that people are familiar with the terms that come with a project. The risk profile, the return, the sector, those kinds of things. And to do this, we've picked 5 sectors that already have track record in generating a return. And I think Max mentioned most of them. We've got sustainable agriculture, forest landscape restoration and conservation, green infrastructure for water, coastal zone resilience, essentially investing in mangroves and coral reefs, and coastal zone fisheries. The intent is to enable investors to put much more significant amounts of money into projects that are much bigger overall than the ones we currently have available. So you start by standardizing them. We have produced a guidebook to the creation of an investment blueprint, which is on our website. The website is cpicfinance.com. I'll hand a card out to anybody who's interested later so they can go and have a look at it. The idea is that the handbook essentially takes your project developer from somebody with a project idea to a project that's actually got a business plan attached to it, where you can show what the return on investment is. And the way we describe this in our the process that works within CPIC is you're basically putting on cash flow goggles. You look at your project and you can see where it is in that project you're going to generate cash flow. a return. And that's the source of revenue that you can use to repay an investor. After that, it's just a matter of constructing a finance vehicle that you can put money into. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's the general idea. So once you've standardized your project, you can then replicate it across lots of different similar cases around the world. Say you have a sustainable cattle ranching project in South America. The land management issues, the governance, the policy may vary somewhat between countries, but basically the recipe for success based on things that have already happened and are successful is relatively easy to replicate. The third thing you do is to aggregate them. Put them into big bundles so they are big enough for an investor to really get their teeth into. Now, it's not quite such a big issue for impact investors because they're often looking for smaller investments, but if you want to get an investment in front of an institutional investor like a pension fund, they don't get out of bed in the morning for less than $200 million. And that's got to be no more than 20% of an overall issue. So you're talking about issues of bonds or whatever they might be that are in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. And to do that, you've got to combine lots and lots of projects together in order that you have the volume appropriate to the scale of the problem. So the way you can bundle the projects together and then make them investable is by surrounding the projects that you have in sets of risk management tools. And these go all the way from grant support to your project developers to do business planning. This is money that could easily come from BIOFIN partners, for instance. Could also come from public finance institutions in the countries where you're working, where you're supporting conservation entrepreneurs to put together business plans that are then investable. You then work through the kinds of funding that an impact investor might put forward, where they are pretty risk tolerant, but they'd like to get their money back if they can, all the way to an institutional investor who will put in lots of money after all that initial work has been done and make the project a big success. That's one of the things actually that impact investors really like about the idea of this credit stack, is that their money is being leveraged by 5 to 1, 10 to 1, because of the much greater volumes of private finance that can flow to a project if it has impact investment money already in it. The third thing that we do that I think is, sorry.
You need your mic closer.
Sorry, okay, yes, all right. The third thing we do, which is solving the problem I referred to originally, is figure out what it is you can do to measure the return on investment for biodiversity. And I work for IUCN. We work on tools like the Red List of Species, Key Biodiversity Areas, Protected Planet, data to do with the distribution and relative importance for conservation of biodiversity across the planet. So what we've been trying to do is to figure out how you can measure the change in the risk of species extinction as a result of your investment. And this could be a metric that goes alongside the return, the financial return on investment, that shows an impact investor that in fact they're generating more than just a financial return, but actually generating a conservation return as well. That's a project underway, something that we've been working on for a while. I hope we'll finish the road testing for that in a few months, and we'll have a publication which will show you in fact how it works. The other aspect of research which is very important is to find out how it is that investments actually succeed. What are the conditions that you need to put in place in order that you can generate the return you need to attract private investors? So those are the three main areas of activity that CPIC is focused on at the moment.
I will pass the floor to our colleague from the Ministry of Planning in Brazil. Yeah, sorry, this mic's. Yeah, I will just, we'll have times for discussion later on. I think some of the challenges that you mentioned are both related to the financial return as well as to the measure of impact, which are the basic definitions of impact investment. But the good news is like a lot of work has been already done, and that we have a few templates, we have a few projects that may be replicated at scale. I'm just having a technical stop to put the presentation on. Yes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Okay. So, thank you all for being here. This presentation, its main goal is to show you opportunities for investment in natural resources and biodiversity in Brazil. And I'm talking about impact investments in the sense that Frank just explained to you, that are investments that they have a sort of return. Well, and these investment opportunities that I'm going to talking about, they are driven by public policies. So to sum up, the goal here is to show these investment opportunities. We are talking about impact investments, and they are driven by public policies. On the very beginning, I will just give you an overview of our country. So I'm going to talk about some macroeconomic indicators and talk about also about our natural resources. And then I'm going to talk about these investment opportunities. So, okay, should be. I can use the laptop, no problem. Well, so I already gave you a sketch of the presentation, so let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about some economic highlights in Brazil. Well, so we are the 90th largest GDP in the world. We are the 5th largest country, and there are a lot of investments going to our country either, and you are net external creditor. Well, these are our GDP per capita, about $8,727. And I would like just to highlight the sharp decline in poverty in our country in the last 20 years. It was about 30%. And this sharp decline in poverty you can see either when you take a look at the Human Development Index. So between 1990 and 2015, there was an increase about 23% on this index. So this graph, it sums up these trends on social indicators. So you can see that most of our improvements in the Human Development Index, they are driven by the improvement on education indicators. And it is driven either by improvement on healthcare services. So the increase in GDP isn't helping so much in this increase on Human Development Index. And something that I'd like to to comment either is that on 1988, we had a new constitution in our country. And this new constitution demanded a lot of public investment in education, in social care, in healthcare. So likely these improvements are related to our new constitution. I'm not saying that we don't have problems in education, in healthcare, but there are improvements since this new constitution. Our country, we have many activities in the industrial sector. You are a key player in the agricultural industry, and you have, concerning natural resources, there is a huge opportunities to invest either. Talking about our biodiversity, so we can see these green areas, the Amazon region. So most of our fresh water is in this area, in the Amazon region. The yellow area, it's the driest area in our country. In between, you have you have the Cerrado that it's a mix of these both characteristics, but most of our population is on the coastal side, and the coastal area, you don't have so much rain as you have in the Amazon region, but in the coastal area, most of the hydroelectric power plants in our country are on the coastal area, where we have most of our population. Well, this is just to have an idea of the problems that we have of threatened species. In this picture, there is a scale of this threat. So going down, the lower you go on the picture, the greater is the threat of this type of species. Well, this picture is just to give an idea of the natural resources that you have either, in particular, the conservation areas. So in this map, we have all the conservation areas in our country. And we're talking about 70% of the national territory. So it's a huge area. And we're talking about, if you sum up all these conservation areas, so we're talking about the territory of France, Spain, Germany, and Italy together. So it's really a huge area that are already classified, that has to be conserved. Well, but since we have so much conservation areas, there is a problem. How can you provide resources to finance this conservation? So the goal of the current government is to strengthen public-private partnerships. These public-private partnerships are the way to provide resources for these conservation areas. And what I'm going to talk about, detail for you right now, is such policies and such investment opportunities. First, we have 73 national parks, and these 73 national parks, they generate a revenue about $500 million. So it's a significant revenue. And the problem is, it's a significant revenue, but most of this revenue, 70% of this revenue, they come just 4 parks. So among all of the 73, just 4, they respond for 70% of this revenue. This is a sign that there is a lot of work, there is a lot of potential to be explored. And to explore this potential, this revenue potential, right now we're studying public-private partnerships in 42 national parks. In this map, it gives you an idea of these studies. So all these points are national parks that we're studying public-private partnerships. In some of them, we already have these partnerships. This is an example of a public partnership that is going on. This park is in the state of São Paulo. And we're talking about six public parks. And the expected benefits of these public-private partnerships, it's around $5 million either in 30 years. So in 30 years, the expected benefits, and I'm talking about investments and government take, we're talking about 5 million in 30 years. This public park is not a federal one. It's from the city of São Paulo, and there will be an auction for those who want to manage this park, and the winner would be those that pays to the government the highest government take. Well, but these public-private partnerships, we don't have only for national parks, we have also for public forests. And there are different legislation for them. For the public forests, there is a law that regulates this kind of public-private partnership. And we already, in the private sector, already management something about 1 million hectares of public forests. Well, in this year, the goal of the federal government is to give to the private sector something about 300,000 hectares of public forests to the private sector. And this is one of them. This public forest is in the north of our country, in the Amazon region. And it's about 33,000 hectares. The second one is much larger. It's also in the Amazon region, in the state called Amapá. And the studies are going on. So the purpose is to give to the private sector these 2 public forests. So I'm talking about public partnerships. That means the private sector has to pay the government to have these public forests. And there are conservation goals. So they have the commitment to protect the biodiversity of these areas. It's not about, I'm not talking only about a profitable business. I'm talking about the commitment that the private sector have to protect those areas, the biodiversity and its natural resources. The second strategy that the federal government has to provide, to take money from the private sector and to invest on natural resources and protection of biodiversity is this fund. This is not a public fund. This is a private fund, and this fund is how it works. You can donate for this fund. This fund is, you have a public bank that manages this fund, and the private sector could donate for this fund. And this fund, they select projects. There is a contest for the best projects for biodiversity and natural resources conservation. So the best projects gets money from this project. So this is the idea. And until now, this fund, they were able to invest about $300 million in conservation, in projects for biodiversity and natural resources conservation. Well, this is a third policy. And in this policy, we're talking about resources from the private sector either. But in this case, the private sector doesn't implement the policies or the commitments. It's the government that implements the actions. The private sector does give this money to the government. But there is a detail here. This money, it doesn't go into the public budget. And it doesn't go through the public budget because when the resources goes into the public budget, there are many controls. The management of these resources, it's much more difficult because you need transparency, much more controls for these resources. But since they are private resources, you can manage can manage it in a more efficient way. So it doesn't go into the budget of the public sector. These resources, they stay in a public bank, and the public sector spends from it, uses this banking account. So just a couple of numbers of the use of these resources. So we're talking about $100 million that were spent this way in 2016. Finally, the fourth policy that you're trying to carry out is a committee that, in this committee, you're going to have the private sector and the government, and they together, we study projects to protect the natural resources and biodiversity. So they will study, it's a long-term project, and the whole idea is to put them on the same table and talk about these projects and get to the best solutions of them. This is just the members of the committee, so you have many public agencies here, a couple of companies also. Well, so I hope to have shown you those strategies to finance natural resources and biodiversity in Brazil. And there are many, you can do this in many ways. And I just give you a couple of examples of them. That's all. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. And I think that one of the important messages is that also government have understood the importance of creating the markets and the mechanisms that allow the private sector to take advantage of some of the natural assets. So this proactive engagement and this number of strategies do create the space for market to grow. And without this openness and sometimes even support or even subsidies for certain activities, it might not be possible. What we had is a first introduction of the different templates and consideration on impact investment. We have seen how government are taking it as a priority initiative to financing biodiversity, in addition of others, of course. And now we are looking at a more operational proposal into regenerative finance. And this is happening in Mexico, and I will ask Laura Ortiz to give us an introduction on this proposal and how in practice what you have heard can be turned into investment and businesses. Another little technical break.
Thank you, Max, and thank you everyone for being here. I know it's the session right after lunch. You know, people are always tired. You guys are jet lagged. We even have some biofinance warriors in the room that were up all night, and they are still here. I want to give an applause to Mariana that is still here after being detained for some
Frank,
hours.
Actually.
Yes. And Frank, thank you. Okay, so how many of you have ever heard of impact investing before this session? Raise your hand so I can see it. Okay, so several of you. Okay, I'm glad. So basically we can start having fun. So as Max mentioned, this is a change of paradigm. This is a change of financial paradigms for all financial for the whole financial sector, because impact investment is a practice. It is not a type of investment, it's a practice of how you invest. So basically, I used to be a banker, and I can tell you from the financial perspective that most of the financial decisions are taken always in account of two factors, risk and return, and you probably know that, right? And impact investing is the invitation to put on your 3D glasses, see everything in 3 dimensions. So basically, return, risk, and the impact, the environmental and social impact that every investment decision has. So basically, every investment decision has an impact. Some are positive, some are negative. How do we maximize the positive? How do we minimize the negative? That's the reason for impact measurement, right? So that's the basis of impact investment. And I just want to say, this is very revolutionary for people that work in finance. And for impact investors, what are they looking for in conservation? They don't want to finance process. They want to finance outcomes. They want to see results. So when you guys are looking for investment in the private sector, we need to show outcomes. You need to show us what is the final benefit of this investment. What is the final benefit of every dollar that I spend into your solution, into your government, your country. So basically that is very important to point out. Impact investors don't want to finance process, they want to finance outcomes. We know there is process involved, but show us the outcome. So basically, it's a new way of showcasing and talking about conservation. Instead of focusing on problems, we know a lot about the problems. There's a lot of documentaries about the problems. Instead of focusing on the problems, we need to talk more about the solutions. A more extensive, more explicit talk about solutions. And instead of talking about the needs, how much we need to finance, we need to talk about the potential. Because with time, conservation will generate profits for everyone, will generate a shared prosperity. So we need to talk much more about the potential this will generate instead of just focusing on needs. So it's a huge change, a huge shift of paradigms. And before I show you the presentation on Mexico, I just want to say the mission of our company, I'm an impact investment advisor, basically, and we're advising BIOFIN in Mexico. And our mission is to ensure that humanity is served by capital instead of governed by it. So I wanna do a simple metaphor here. How many of you have been in love? No? Okay. So when you're in love, there's two partners, right? So usually when you're in love and only one partner modifies behavior of no longer being single and now being in love, that's a very unequal relationship, right? But if the two partners modify their relationship, then that's a happy couple, right? Okay, so in impact investment or in regenerative finance, which is also the layer of impact investment that regenerates ecosystems, imagine finance is in love with life. So in regular finance, you have all the projects need to modify their behaviors in order to fit the finance proposal, right? So this is the fund, these are the requirements. If you want my money, you need to modify your behavior. That's a very unequal relationship in finance. But if we both modify behavior, the financial sector, being in love with life, should modify our behavior as well. So for example, the flexible timelines, the longer timelines, right? Instead of accumulative structures like debt, helping with distributive structures like equity. So basically, regenerative finance is a way where finance is in love with life, and because they are in love with life, they modify behavior to fit the profile for financing life. So this is the proposal that we're working on in Mexico. We just started, this is brand new. I'm sorry if I'm shaking, but I've never been in such an important panel globally. And I've been with very little hours of sleep. But anyway, so the Regenerative Investments Consortium that we formed in Mexico is formed by SBX, which is the Impact Investment Advisor, the BIOFIN UNDP wonderful team in Mexico, and the largest conservation fund in Mexico, which is Fondo Mexicano de la Conservación. They have an amazing track record. They've been around for 22 years in the country, have very good reputation. So I don't want to bore you with the details. It's not even working, so I'll just have to narrate to you. So basically, we're looking to finance a very diverse portfolio of investments of regeneration of ecosystems in Mexico. The reason we want to have this diversity, oh, thank you. So I click here?
Okay.
Okay.
I think you need to, because it's a PDF.
Oh. Okay, cool, right there. Thank you. So basically, the diversity of this portfolio is going to include, yes, you guessed it, the agriculture, forestry, water, ranching, fisheries. But instead of looking for sustainable projects, we're going to go beyond sustainability into regeneration. What's the reason for that? Why do we want to go beyond sustainability? Because basically, we don't only want to stop the harm, right? We don't only want to stop the damage. We actually want to restore the ecosystem's health. So, okay, so I want to show you precisely what we mean by that. Oh, this is the arrow, now I see it, okay. I'm sorry, it's hard to manage. Here, okay, so you see this spectrum right here. This is basically how we divide the investments of the world by outcomes. So the worst possible outcome for the world would be our destruction. Is everyone agreeing with that? Is that the worst possible outcome for humanity? Destruction? Okay. So basically, we have a layer of financing that is financing destructive practices. There's a lot of money in finance that goes into weapons. There's a lot of money in finance that goes into budgets for war. So there you have the absolute negative, right? The one that subtracts the most from the world. The second one is the extractive. How many of you know extractive investments? I think everyone, right? It's not only fossil fuels, it's not only mining, it's anything that is taking more out of the ecosystem than the value that you're adding. So you can justify it by number of jobs created, but even the number of jobs created is offset by the negative aspects of the extractive investments. Then you have responsible, and you only know that the responsible are subtracting less, but you don't know how much. Then you have in the middle sustainable. And if you see, there's the arrows that subtract the value to the world, then the bridge towards the ones that are adding value to the world. So the one in the middle, the sustainable, only guarantees our survival. How many of you have the dream of surviving versus how many of you have the dream of thriving lives? So surviving, no? Thriving lives? Yeah. So I think for us and for our children, we want thriving lives, right? We don't want to survive. We want the best potential for everyone, and that's natural. So if we stay in sustainability, we're in a very low bar. We only stop the damage. But if we want to restore health, we want to go deeper. So basically, the second half of the slide, you can see the 3 layers of impact investment. First, you have the social enterprise, which is the investment into the companies that have the intention of doing some social good or environmental good, and they measure it. The second layer is transformative finance. And transformative finance not only has the good intention of doing good and measuring it, but it also uses a structure that distributes the wealth. It distributes the capital generated. So basically, instead of just accumulating capital, it distributes. So the financial structure is very important for transformative finance, and it works very well with communities. Communities and indigenous communities love this because they get much more voice and agency in the decision-making process. And the third is the regenerative capital. So basically, regenerative investments are the ones that take into account the natural capital, the social capital, and the economic capital, not one instead of the other, and not one abusing the other, but the 3 of them are very important. So we need to find those virtuous cycles that give you all 3 capitals regenerated, right? The father of regenerative finance is John Fullerton. You can check out his paper online. It's in PDF. It's available and free for everyone, Regenerative Capitalism. But there's new layers of regenerative finance, and there's new structures for that.